Thank you very, very much for sharing your time with us. We're going to start, believe it or not, the last presentation of WhaleFest Monterey 2018. Thank you so much, though, for coming down. We've got a great way to finalize things with Steve Shimek. Of course, Steve is the executive director and founder, I believe, of the Otter Project. And they do some really wonderful things. They do so many wonderful things. I could not enumerate them, but you know they're really involved, for instance, in researching shipping lanes, which is a very big problem when it comes to marine mammals. And Steve's organization has helped paving the way to improve things out there so we can avoid ship strikes. Lots of great work, of course, with the beautiful furry creatures that make this such a special place. Without further ado, please, warm welcome for Steve Shimek.
Thank you. So my name is Steve, and it's kind of fun because I'm following John, or Dr. John Pierce, and John mentioned that the limpets or the intertidal surveys were 45 years ago. Well, 45 years ago, I was one of John's students, and I think it was year 2 of those intertidal. He and I just talked and coordinated notes, and it was year 2 that I was out doing the intertidal surveys with John. So, you know, it's actually always great to be around John, and so I'm going to try and follow a sex talk, and. I don't know. So here we go. And I encourage you, if you've got short comments, to shout them out as we go. If you have a long question or a long comment, save it till the end. I think I'm going to go kind of about 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and so there should be time at the end. But basically, I'm going to talk about sea otters. And kind of how cool they are. Now, I want to make the point that there's lots of organizations that deal with sea otters, and they all do great work. There is another organization, Friends of the Sea Otter, that does great work, and they just love sea otters, and they're what I would call the otter hugger organization. We're not. I think sea otters are really cool, but we're the organization that uses and abuses sea otters to talk about ocean issues and how to make things better, not only for sea otters, but for all of us. And because it's all connected, we all know that. I hope everyone in this room knows that. And so that's kind of the thread that we're following. We think otters are great communicators. And we also think that they're great tools to frankly use to bring about good ocean policy, because people want to save sea otters, and because of that wanting to save sea otters, it helps us get good policy. So this is who we're talking about, and this is a southern sea otter, and there's kind of 3 populations of sea otters. There's the Russian, there's the northern, and then there's the southern. And we don't really, and I'll show you why, but we don't really know, and there's probably is no real sharp demarcation from one to the other. They probably just all kind of smeared across as they changed. But now we have these kind of 3 distinct subspecies, and probably, I don't know if John would agree with me or not, or maybe if I'm about to get in trouble with my mentor, but I don't even know what a subspecies really is. And so it gets very confusing very fast. So a little bit about the Otter Project, and this will be very quick. This is one slide. And the Otter Project protects our watersheds and coastal oceans for the benefit of sea otters and humans. So humans is in our mission statement. Again, we think everything's connected through ocean science-based policy and advocacy. I think that we tend to use a broader tool chest than many organizations. We do everything from weighing in on political appointees, to drafting legislation, to standing at the podium and saying, you know, you've got to protect those darn sea otters because they're this most wonderful creature, and if you don't do X, you know, sea otters will die. So we do Pound at the Podium advocacy, and we meet with policymakers. We tend to take on things that last for years. Agricultural pollution, ending the No-Otter Zone, which I'll talk about, which is crazy. Those are things that we've been on for 10 years, and when the policy didn't change to be something that we felt was complied and comported with law, we then have lawyers that follow up with the work that we're doing. So it's kind of A to Z, everything from working on political appointees, all the way through policy, all the way through the legal ramifications of trying to protect good policy. So now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about marine mammals. So here's kind of the gamut of marine mammals, almost. So my advisors when I was in college, and I graduated in '75, and some of you may have heard these names, but John Pierce was one of my advisors. Dr. Mary Silver, who's one of the world's experts on ocean harmful algal blooms, was another advisor. And then finally, a guy by the name of Dr. Ken Norris, who was one of the world's experts on marine mammals. And so here's all the marine mammals. And what you see is the wide amount of adaptation to the ocean and variation in these marine mammals. You see the whales and dolphins that have these just incredibly wonderful shapes, and they're just perfectly adapted to their ocean environment. Although I would argue all these animals are adapted to what they do and the way that they live. So there is this current kind of thought that otters are less adapted to the ocean. I don't see that at all. And then you've got the dugongs and manatees, and then you've got the seals and sea lions, and then you've got the sea otters. There's one missing that some people don't think of when they think of marine mammals, and maybe you wouldn't either, and I didn't either, but Ken Norris thought of it as a marine mammal, and that's the polar bear. And so now when you look at this kind of range in organisms and adaptations to the ocean and ways of adapting, you kind of see some interesting things. How to deal with cold is one of the things that really shapes a sea otter's life. And it shapes all mammals that are living in the ocean. And what you see is that you kind of have two kind of mechanisms. You have fat and you have the fur coat. And so that's what you've got. You've got the whales and dolphins and seals and manatees, and then you've got the polar bear and otters having that fur coat. So fat and fur coat, that's how to deal with cold. Use both. And so the adaptations here are just incredible. You see some animals still kind of have paws and feet, some have flippers, some have that fusiform shape. Even within otters, there's a lot of variation. And one of the things that people don't think about is we have a sea otter, which is up here around the northern Pacific, where we have upwelling. Where's the other place that has upwelling? Off the coast of South America. And guess where there's another sea otter. It's called the Marine Otter, but it's not our sea otter, but it is an ocean otter just like we have here off the coast of South America. So our otters are not alone. So here we go. Now I'm narrowing the discussion from marine mammals and all the otters. I'm narrowing the discussion to generally, there will be a couple slides where I talk about the other otters, but, our California sea otters. Well, our otters are called by some a keystone species. And a keystone species, in my mind, isn't about how important you are. That's not it. It's about whether or not your presence or absence brings a cascading change to your environment. And you have the California sea otter, that basically it eats a lot. Does anybody know how much a sea otter eats? Yeah, up to 1/3, about 25 to 30% of body weight. Now think about that. Think about it the easiest way, and maybe some of you can't relate it because you are healthier than I am, but think about it in terms of quarter pounders. A quarter pounder is 25% of your body weight. So if you weigh, 160 pounds, you need to eat 160 quarter pounders in a day to survive. And I've tried and it doesn't work. And I've tried it with pizza. And so I guess what I'm getting at is these things consume a lot. And that's part of the reason probably that they bring about this cascade in their environment where things just dramatically change, with and without sea otters, is because they consume just a lot. And John and I were talking about it the other day. Think about that 100 otters in Elkhorn Slough and what that means to the slough. There's this large number of otters, and there's not in my wildest dreams as a marine biology student did I ever think that slough would be productive enough to support 100 otters. It's crazy. Because think of what that 100 or more otters is eating. Now, yes, some of the otters are going out of the slough and foraging in and near shore around the slough. But there's also often more than 100 otters. I thought that the slough would go up and down in its population of sea otters. They would overeat it, then they would leave, then they would rediscover it and come back. And no, what we're seeing is that system, that estuarian system, is able to support that huge number of otters. It's remarkable, absolutely remarkable. So sea otters are eating, and they're eating the things that eat kelp and algae. So in other words, they're eating meat. And one of the basic changes that you can think of that a sea otter does is without otters, you almost have this meat-based system. You have urchins and abalone that are what we might think of as overgrazing, but they're eating all the algae down to bare rock and leaving what some would call an urchin barrens. They just eat it down to, just essentially bare rock, where you get some coral and algae, you get some algae, and it's not absolute. In other words, there are these places like down in the Channel Islands where you don't really have otters, and you do have kelp forests down there. I would argue that those kelp forests will probably get much bigger once the otters return, but that's a guess. But I think that generally what we see is this flip-flop from this environment where we have these urchins and these abalone to basically an algae system. And this is just kind of an aside, but one of the things that happened in my personal evolution is I've been an environmentalist all my life and had that thought, but I always thought that I needed a reason. Why do I think the way I do? What are my base principles that drive me to the way that I am? And for me, it was primary productivity and diversity. I wanted systems that had a lot of primary productivity, were capturing sunlight, creating life. And then I thought that as a kind of thoughtful person, I wanted to have systems that were really diverse. And that's what otters do. They stimulate primary productivity because they eat all the things that are eating the algae, so the system becomes dominated by algae, which not dominated, but lots of algae. So then it captures a lot of sunlight, makes more algae, and that more algae is now leading to tons of things that are eating off all that stuff. And then finally what you're getting is fishes that then come into the kelp forest and are there. So it's this remarkable thing that actually otters, in some ways, they create more life than what was there before them, and certainly more diverse life. And so those are the values that I've kind of embraced and said, that's the basis of my environmentalism. So now let's talk about otters before a bunch of us came around. And this is, so move your focus become a marine biologist for a moment and move your focus from being over North America to being over the North Pacific. And then look down, and what you see is a range. Otters are primarily, well, not primarily, are coastal. They don't drift off 100 miles offshore, though they do cover some distance occasionally. And so their range went from Hokkaido, Japan, along up the Russian coast, across the Aleutian Islands, and then down the coast of North America, all the way down to mid-Baja. That's the original range. One of the interesting things that Carl Kenyon wrote when he first studied otters was he says, well, in his book he talks about why did they just go to mid-Baja, and one of the things that he talks about is they get to mid-Baja and sink, and he actually mentions that they sink. They can't float. So I don't know if it's the particular, I have no idea why, but they sink. So then there was the exploitation. And they've always been used. Their fur is a really good fur. But then what happened was they were discovered by Europeans and the fur became fashionable. And it wasn't really driven to make, people say, well, people need to stay warm. It wasn't about that at all. It was about fashion. And so the otters were hunted, and they were first hunted by the Alaskan sea otter hunters were actually enslaved and then, brought into the hunt. And it was amazing because the hunt was the Spanish, it was the French, it was the English. And in fact, you can read some of the old things where they talk about the wealth of some of the East Coast towns was from sea otter fur. And the trade was the ships, the hunting ships would come, they would go around the bottom of South America, come up into the Pacific, and then they would plot, their trade was to get the furs, then go to Asia, sell the furs, get Asian products, and then bring them back to the East Coast. And think about what that took. I mean, it's just amazing. And sea otter furs were incredibly valuable. In fact, you read some accounts where it was a straight trade for the pelt weight for gold. Straight trade. So we're talking something that was producing wealth. Vast amounts of wealth. And I don't know if any of you stopped by my booth at Whale Fest, but one of the things is that I have a full fur there, and it's a big fur. And it's heavy. And so a full coat of sea otter fur would weigh, 40 or 50 pounds, probably, if you had a full-length coat. So yes, there were occasionally full-length coats and cloaks used by the Alaskan tribes, but they were primarily ceremonial. And they were trim around European and Asian fashion. They were muffs. They were hat trim. They were, the collar around a coat. And it's amazing. This hunt started in the 1700s, and by the end of the 1700s, it was on the decline. So this is sea otter skins exported from California. And what you see is that by the early 1800s, I don't know if you can read those numbers. I don't know if I can read those numbers. But the decline starts in that second time scale is 1801 to 1809. So excuse me, the decline started. And it's amazing because some people talk about that the sea otters were the first gold rush in California. And this is just kind of fun stuff. If you grew up here in California, you were taught that the Spanish missionaries, came along and started creating missions, and it was about, let's bring Christ to the Indians and all that sort of stuff. No. Now, I do have a sea otter-centric world. I know that. But what it was about, and there's scholarly articles written about this, and I'd be happy to send them to you, The Russians were hunting sea otters as well, and so Spain claimed what is now California. The Russians were hunting sea otters as well, and as they came around from the north, they were colonizing. And the Spanish had never colonized. So Spain was terribly worried that they were going to lose their claim, so they had to colonize, and they did it with the missions, and of course the missions were supported by troops. So then what happened was the hunt happened, and the sea otter population got terribly fragmented. Hokkaido, Japan was gone. There were some otters off the coast of Russia. There were some otters up in the Aleutians. But there were all these little isolated populations. And what you see from this is that there were still otters off the coast of Baja in 1911. There was actually a pair. The problem was that they were the same sex. So they were there, but the same sex. So then what you see is that some of these populations just were not numerous enough to keep going. And what you saw was a further collapse in the sea otter population, even after they became protected, because they just didn't have the numbers to survive. And so what you see is otters off the coast of Russia, otters off the coast of the Aleutians. And then what you also see is that little star off the coast of California. Otters were thought to be extinct off the coast of California. They were thought to be gone. There were probably some people down towards Big Sur that knew that they were there, but generally they were thought to be gone and extinct. And it wasn't until literally the opening of the coastal highway in 1938 when a naturalist from Cal Academy took a drive and saw this raft of sea otters. And there was this headline of, in the Oakland Tribune, I remember the pull quote, but I forget the headline, but the headline was "Extinct Marine Mammal Found Again." But the pull quote within a document from this naturalist from Cal Academy was, "It was like seeing Tyrannosaurus Rex walking the beach." I mean, they were thought to be gone, and they were thought to have been gone for a long time. And then here was this group. Sea otters were abused by the hunt, so now I'm about to go to the downer of this story, and it'll get better from here. But you see that from the left, the 1, 2, 3, fourth star from the left, that's Amchitka Island, Alaska. Well, Amchitka, if you're old enough, maybe rings a bell. And that was the largest population of sea otters that existed. And that's where America decided to test the hydrogen bomb. And in fact, sea otters were used as a way to gauge what the mortality was. Now, these were underground tests, but they actually gauged the lethality of the bomb from the seismic event by the number of sea otters killed. So here you had this population that had been decimated, and then we blew up the rest. Now, there is a good part of this story, and then what they basically did was that just before they blew up the bomb, they moved a whole bunch of otters from Amchitka, and they sprinkled them all over. But now, remember I said, well, we don't know where the boundary line is between Russian, northern, and southern. And so now what they did was that they took one population, the northerns, and basically sprinkled them from British Columbia down to Oregon and Washington and all over the place. So some of those populations never made it, and some of them exist today. But now we have these northern otters, and we actually don't know whether or not the southern otters would have been up there, or, in other words, if that's the right sea otter for the spot. Genetically different? Slightly genetically different, yes, ever so slightly. So they can tell them apart in terms of genetics, and then there are a couple of kind of skull measurements that are also different. And then also part of the behavior can be used to help define a subspecies, and this actually impacted me. When I was a graduate student, one of the things I did was I walked the beach, and southern sea otters were, and part of the behavioral classification was that southern species never came ashore and hauled out. And I found otters hauled out along along Pebble Beach Golf Course. And I wanted to write about it, and actually some sea otter biologists at the time that were also kind of advocates said, oh no, don't tell anybody, don't write any about that. We use that as part of the definition for the subspecies. So science can be a little jaded too. So by the late 70s, here's what we had. We had Russian, we had Aleutian, and then we had British Columbia, southern Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, and California sea otters, and those are the populations. That now, if you remember that range, we're actually getting in better and better and better shape. So that's what we have today as far as range of sea otters. You still see some gaps. We don't know actually how far otters range. In other words, there was an otter spotted up in Oregon a while back, and you can see that, well, you can't really tell from that map, but you know, the northern limit of the California sea otters thought to go up to somewhere right around Half Moon Bay, sometimes San Francisco Bay, sometimes Point Reyes. But then there was this otter found up in Oregon, and the speculation is that it was California otter. So how far are these animals ranging? I have no idea. We have the southern end of the range is supposed to go to about Point Conception, and yet we find there was an otter spotted down in Baja. There are otters spotted down in LA Harbor, Orange County. Now, sea otters are an endangered species success story. They truly are. You know, the range back in 1910 that we thought they were thought to be extinct, but it was certainly a small number. Probably somewhere between 10 and 50 animals is the original stock. Now, if you're a biologist, you'll say, well, didn't they go through a genetic bottleneck? You know, there's been tests of what's called heterozygosity, and they seem to be just fine. And where we used to think that genetic bottlenecks were a big deal, and maybe they are, I'm again terribly confused, just like I am about subspecies, in that the elephant seal started from a very small population, and now we have tons of elephant seals that are almost clones of one another, and they seem to be doing great. So, you know, don't rest on every single laurel that you may think you have. It's kind of crazy out there. And you'll see on the far right of this graph some wild kind of movement in the numbers, and we'll get there. We're about to get there. So now we're going to kind of just look at that right-hand spot. I do want to bring up one other thing. You'll see that 1983, there seems to be a low spot. That was kind of the last and final kind of intrusion onto sea otters' lives. That's when the gillnet fishery along the California coast was going great guns, and before it was outlawed, many of the fishermen totally denied that they ever caught a sea otter, and then an observer was put on, and the first day of the first pull of the first net had a dead sea otter in it. So now we've got the spring surveys. Now these are the raw counts. This is actually the number of sea otters that were counted. You see one gap, but generally every year there's a spring count, and what you see is that the numbers vacillate. Now, what is that vacillation? Probably that vacillation to a great extent is weather and the count, because it's an actual physical count. They go out there and they count the sea otters, and not over a day, because they can't get it done in a day. Sometimes the count can go on for months, because they don't get one area or another area, and so then they go out. And so some of those otters are probably moving around, leaving, coming back, whatever. And so that's the count, and a lot of the variation is probably due to weather. But also, you know, kind of squint your eyes a little bit, and that's probably what is really going on. And what that does is it leads you to the actual, what they use for sea otter counts, which is the 3-year running average. So they take 3 years, the 3 most recent years, and then they average those years, and that gives you the count. Now, what I want to point out is that really dramatic things can happen. So I'm going to go back. You can see that the number of otters in the 2017 count, the raw count, goes down quite a lot. It goes down from 3,000. I can't read it, but anyway, it goes down well over 100 otters. It goes down a bunch, and then when you look at the 3-year running average, you see that it actually goes down a much smaller amount, and so that dampens. So if there were a real event, we wouldn't catch it right away necessarily. We would catch it in a raw count, but we would wonder whether or not it was weather. So there can be some things that happen when you do it this way, but probably doing it this way is probably gives you a better accurate of the ups and downs of the population. Now here's the trick, and this is important to consider, and I'm about to maybe go a little political on you. I apologize. There is a number when the otter becomes delisted. That is when the 3-year running average is 3,090 over 3 years. We have been over that now for 2 years, and that first year that it was over by so much that it will probably carry the 3rd year. So our otter will be up for delisting from the Endangered Species Act next year. I would suggest to you that the current administration will delist the sea otter as fast as it possibly can. Why? Because sea otters and other marine mammals, whales and dolphins, impact where you can site offshore oil drilling. And so what we have is a very pro-drilling administration, and we have things that are in the way. In the U.S. Congress right now, there are bills that weaken the Endangered Species Act and eliminate the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So what will happen, now I'm talking worst case, what you could see is you could see some of these animals delisted, like the sea otter, and then they lose all protection, so that's bad enough. But then they also no longer become a barrier to oil drilling. So as an action item, you don't need to know the bill numbers. You don't need any of those details. Simply call your congressman and say, I want you to protect the Endangered Species Act, and I want you to protect the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Moving on, so you at one point you had numbers. Now you have range expanding along the coast, and what you see, there's the discovery site, Bixby Creek, kind of along the Big Sur coast, 1938, and those otters kind of spreading north and south as you go. It kind of ends in 1998, and we really haven't seen range expansion since then in a significant way. Now you look at, okay, and here's where I kind of come in, and I say, okay, what's killing otters? What are the things that I can impact? Now, this is a fairly old graph. I've seen no newer graph. You see shark bite being about 10%. That's actually much larger now. And I actually have members that said, I hate sharks. I wish they would all go away. Why are they coming back? Why doesn't somebody kill them all? Well, actually, sharks are probably an indicator of a healthier and healthier system. They probably are. So maybe I'm the only shark fan out here, but we like sharks. Sharks are a healthy ocean, and so sharks, and now they're eating otters, they're eating, other marine mammals, occasionally taking a bite out of a surfer, it's all good. And so that's the situation. I tend not to look at the shark bite, and I tend to look at all the things that are human-induced. So there's things like trauma. Can we do something about that? I would say that some of these things are small, like mating trauma. I can't do anything about that. Otters bite each other when they have sex. John didn't talk about it. I'll talk about it. And otters bite each other, and that's the way it is. And people bite each other too. So then there's gunshot, then there's fishery interactions, and then there's lots of disease. There is lots of disease. But when you actually look at and ask yourself, what is the disease that is killing otters? It's not one, it's a bunch. Don't think that Toxoplasma gondii is out there wreaking havoc on the population. It's not. It's a ton of different diseases. Toxoplasma is one small slice. And if you actually take, and this is where scientists tend to get gross and disgusting, if you take a piece of liver, which is the organ that filters things, and you grind it up, and you see what are the chemicals that are in it. And so here's 3 chemicals, and look at the difference between the contaminant load in the liver of the various populations of sea otters. The Russian population on the left, through the Aleutians, through Prince William Sound, Alaska, Washington, and then California. So this brings us to what we think is going on as far as the disease. We think immune-suppressed otters are swimming around in a soup of disease. And we tend to ask ourselves about that immune suppression a lot, because the chemicals that I just looked at are all immune suppressants. They are all immune suppressants. And so it's almost kind of like the AIDS thing in some way. When AIDS first happened, people were talking about an especially virulent, type of flu or something like that, or some other disease. And then they realized it was immune suppression. And that's maybe, I'm not saying that otters have AIDS. I'm saying that possibly you have an immune suppressed population out there. So now I'm getting to sort of kind of the last part of my talk, and that's what is the Otter Project doing about all this stuff? We tend to think of our job as having 3 parts. We maybe should have a 4th, which is fisheries interactions, but habitat, oil, and water quality. On the habitat part, you have marine protected areas. Those will help otters. They bring about a richer ecosystem. They bring about a system that has less fishery interactions. So marine protected areas are good. And we were really active, so was John, in creating the network of marine protected areas. I worked a little bit on the initial legislation. I worked a really lot on the creation of the Central Coast Network, and then I worked a little bit as the network expanded statewide. And then there's the No-Otter Zone. Otters were not allowed by federal law in Southern California, and so we sued the federal government to end the No-Otter Zone. It just is gone, but not forgotten. Now other people have started to sue back to try and get the No-Otter Zone back. We were in court just last month on the No-Otter Zone once again. We think it'll be gone this time, we hope. Sorry.
Can you comment on Sandy?
Right, so the way that the No-Otter Zone happened was that they thought that a catastrophic, this was before Exxon Valdez, they thought that one catastrophic oil spill could wipe out the entire population. So they thought, let's create a reserve population on San Nick. And then the Navy and the oil industry and the shellfish fishermen went berserk, and they said, if you do that, we want this. And that's the way the zone got created. But there was a provision in the law when it was created that says if San Nick fails, the No-Otter Zone goes away. And there were specific numeric criteria that were specified of what defined failure. And it met those criteria, but then the No-Otter Zone was never gotten rid of. So again, we sued the government over not doing what it was supposed to do in ending the No-Otter The population off San Nick is actually doing quite well, but it didn't for a long time. And it's still not doing, there are still not the number of otters that were put there in the 1980s. So in other words, there was, I think, 149 or 150 otters put there. A very small number stayed. Everyone else just swam around. It appears, some people claim randomly, so a bunch of otters swam straight out to sea. Some otters swam north and back to Monterey and where they were captured from. Some otters swam wherever, but a large number died, and a very large number were never ever seen again. Did I answer that? Yes. Good, thanks. Oil. We are very involved in offshore oil drilling. In fact, people don't know that we don't have a moratorium in California or the U.S. government against offshore oil drilling. We have a moratorium against leases. Well, there was all these leases developed in Southern California. No one knew that there were 34 leases that were not developed that would have brought oil rigs all the way up to San Luis Obispo into the Otter Range. So when the price of oil went up about 10 years ago, the people that had those leases said, drill, baby, drill. And we sued the federal government over those leases with some other groups. A provision of those leases were that they were use it or lose it leases. That the government said, you're going to get this lease and you either prove up on the lease within X number of years or you lose the lease. They didn't do that. So once again, the suit was against the U.S. government over not doing what they said that they were going to do. Now we have the new threat of offshore oil drilling. But really off our coast right now and in the years, what we have is a problem of tanker collisions that could really happen. And up to the year 2000, I don't know how many of you are long timers here, but you used to be able to go to the beach and watch a tanker go by. You don't see that anymore. And frankly, otters are what did that. Otters moved those tankers offshore. So until 2000, otters literally came out of San Francisco Bay if they were headed for LA. And they literally came out of San Francisco Bay, drove straight at Pigeon Point, made the turn at Pigeon Point, drove straight at Point Sur, made the turn at Point Sur, pointed straight at Point Arguello, made the turn at Point Arguello, and those points define the convex California coast. And that's the way they went, because that was the shortest, fastest way. That brought them very close. Well, especially at Point Sur, think about a tanker. It's impossible to stop a tanker. So in other words, you can't just drive up and tow it away with your little old motorboat. It takes a super tug. It takes that super tug has to muster, and you're only found in San Francisco and LA. So what you have to do is you have to create a network where those tankers and those big container ships that have a ton of fuel oil have to be far enough off the coast where you can rescue them before they get driven aground by a stiff wind. And so that's what was created with the offshore lanes. None of those lanes existed before 2000. The sanctuary and a really dedicated group of stakeholders and otters are, I want to think, I'm otter-centric, is what did this. Here's the way the lanes look now. Now that doesn't mean that all the ships all the time are following the lanes, but it's better than it was. It had to go all the way through the United Nations, the International Maritime Organization. Finally, water quality. Our water quality program is called Monterey Coastkeeper, which is part of the Waterkeeper Alliance, which was started by Bobby Kennedy and is international, and it is litigious. We protect the laws of the Clean Water Act, and in the state that we're in California, the Porter Cologne Act is actually stronger than the Clean Water Act. Kids get why otters are dying from water quality. All this stuff is flowing into the ocean, and then the otters are somehow either eating it or getting contaminated by it. So kids get it. Now, I want to make the point of probably most of you are from the more well-heeled part of Monterey Bay or Monterey. There's another Monterey County. Look at that graph that is sort of kind of on the central coast, just south of Monterey Bay. It is the greatest slice of red, which is extreme toxicity in the entire state of California. The red and orange together, the red, orange, and yellow together, which are, the yellow is some toxicity, the orange is moderate, and the red is extreme. It's the highest percentage of toxicity in the state of California. So, well-heeled Monterey County, wake up. Monterey County surface water, in general, is the poorest in the state of California. If you look at toxicity as locally, very close Central Coast, here's toxicity. This is of water. This is invertebrate survival. So this is where they don't actually measure toxicity. They measure it by, let's take a sample of water and then let's put life in it. And water is not supposed to kill the life that lives in it. And red means it killed it all. That's our toxicity test for Monterey. And the other place, where is that? That's down on the lower Santa Maria River. All agricultural regions, intense agriculture. That's what your water looks like if you go up the Salinas Valley a little ways. And that's why the Otter Project over the past couple of years is not that popular, because we have sued agriculture. Or we have sued the state of California for not regulating agriculture. But again, let's end now by getting real. Otters are doing great. They're doing better than they have ever done. I grew up on San Francisco Bay in Redwood City. It's so much better now than it ever used to be. I spent 20 years in Montana, and I learned while I was there that moose were thought to be extinct in North America. There's moose all over the place now, where there used to be in the Rocky Mountains. Many things are getting better. Some things are getting worse. We need to continue to pay attention, and we need to keep going. Otters are worth saving, but mostly they provide us with a communications mechanism to talk to people, and they create a value for people that's worth saving. That's it. If anyone wants to get a hold of me. Okay. Any questions?
Question, in Moss Landing, I understand that they closed off the underpassage so the otters couldn't get from the bay into the slough or the wetland area, and that one or more have been run over.
Yes.
What's happening?
So it's actually, sort of, kind of, yes. What I mean by that is that it wasn't closed off because of otters. It was closed off because, boy, I'm going to get in so much trouble. It was closed off because of agriculture, and when the high tides come up, and you would think that tides are a natural thing, but they have now farmed all the way into the high tide area up the slough up there. And so agriculture installed flapper gates, so when in those culverts, so when the tide comes up, those gates close and don't allow the high tide back up into the slough. And so the otters couldn't get through those flapper gates and were coming out on top of the road. Now, I would be an advocate to take the flapper gates out and let the slough be a slough. There's no way in the world that that'll happen. Yes. Yeah?
We're from Alaska, and for a number of years, so we went through that Trump Valdez, and the population was devastated. It has, in the last 2 years, though, it has come back, at least in areas of South
Right.
gangbusters to the extent that our mussel population is disappearing.
That's right.
And I don't know what is going on. I mean, we've got this climate stuff. That makes me think.
No, otters eat a ton. So what you've got is the reason that the otters are coming back so strong is it appears that in these really complex coastlines, otters do really, really, really well. And so when we have a fairly linear coastline in California, so that's why we've had actually kind of a slower return of our sea otters. But in those really complex situations, you get otters are coming back really, they do really well. And then what happens is, just like I talked about, the keystone species and the shift, well, the fisheries also have to shift, but fisheries don't like to shift. So what you have is that you have, I'll talk about the California situation, but it's the same up there, is what you've got is otters. As that otter moves in, we end up with a lot of gunshot otters, like right on that expanding range. And then what happens is that the fishery shifts and says, we just can't shoot them all. We're just, and the otters are here, and then they change from shellfish to fish. And that's a generalization, but that's what's going on. So yes, you're going to, you've got an urchin fishery up there that is in decline. You've got a sea cucumber fishery up there that is in decline. And otters are getting otters are better predators than people. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thanks.